Chapter 1. The Unexpected Visitor. Jason Hale had always been a man who found comfort in the routine. His world was defined by the clink of tools, the hum of machines, and the steady rhythm of his own thoughts as he worked in the quiet confines of his small auto repair shop. He didn't have grand ambitions, nor did he yearn for anything more than what his life already offered. A mechanic by trade, Jason had long since given up on the idea of becoming someone important. He liked the simplicity of his life, easy, predictable, and without drama. The idea of making a difference, of reaching beyond his small world to touch others, was something he had let go of long ago. The world was big, and he was just a small piece of it, and that was fine. The evening had settled into a familiar quiet. Jason had just finished his shift at the shop and was walking back to his apartment, a modest, weather-worn building on the edge of the city, away from the hustle and bustle of urban life. He preferred it that way. There was a certain peace in the isolation that surrounded his life. The streets were empty as usual, the city lights casting an orange glow across the cracked sidewalks and empty streets. A thin layer of frost clung to the air, making the ground slick and the night feel a little colder than usual. As Jason walked, his breath came out in small clouds, each exhale seeming to disappear into the night as quickly as it formed. He had become accustomed to these solitary walks, finding solace in the rhythm of his steps and the quiet that surrounded him. As a child, he had always enjoyed the peace that came with the nighttime hours, when the world seemed to settle down, and the chaos of the day faded into the stillness of the evening. But tonight, something felt off. There was a subtle unease in the air, a sense that things were about to shift in a way that Jason could not predict. His instincts, honed over years of quiet observation, told him something wasn't quite right. It was then that he saw her lying in a heap in front of his doorstep. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than a pile of discarded clothes, a bag of trash perhaps, or a stray animal seeking shelter from the biting cold. But as he neared, something in the shape of the form stirred something deep inside him. It wasn't right. The way the figure huddled, small and fragile, its limbs curled in upon itself, suggested vulnerability. Jason's steps slowed, and his heart rate quickened. It was a woman, though at first, it was hard to tell just how human she was. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, the color of ash. Her clothes, what little she wore, were ragged and torn, ill-suited for the cold night. Her face was partially obscured by a mass of matted, tangled hair that hung limply over her features, but even in her state of unconsciousness, there was something strangely captivating about her. The angles of her face were sharp, almost too sharp for a human, and her ears, there was no mistaking them, were pointed, much more so than any human's. They were large, with a curve that looked distinctly non-human, a trait that set her apart from the average person. The way she lay there, so small and fragile, as if the world had discarded her, made Jason's heart tighten with a sudden and unfamiliar compassion. He knelt down beside her, his fingers brushing lightly against her cool skin as he checked for a pulse. It was faint but present, a thread of life clinging to her in the midst of her suffering. Jason's mind raced. He didn't know who she was, where she came from, or what had happened to her, but it was clear that she was in trouble. She was cold, shivering, and her breaths were shallow and erratic. He could see the faintest tremors ripple through her body, evidence of the pain she was enduring. Jason's hands moved quickly, working out of pure instinct. He scooped the girl up, cradling her carefully in his arms. Despite her frailness, her body felt unnaturally light, almost weightless. As he carried her up the stairs to his apartment, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to this moment, something he couldn't explain. When he entered his apartment, Jason laid her down on his couch, gently covering her with an old, worn blanket he had kept for years. He went to the small kitchen to fetch a glass of water, trying to shake the tension that had settled in his chest. His hands were shaking slightly as he filled the glass, unsure of what to do next. He wasn't a doctor, and he certainly wasn't someone who was prepared to handle an alien or whatever she was on his doorstep. But something deep inside him told him that this girl, this mysterious being who had appeared in his life so suddenly, was important. He returned to the living room and sat down beside her, the glass of water resting on the table in front of him. Her eyes remained closed, but her breathing had steadied somewhat, and her body had stopped shaking. He watched her closely, not sure if he should leave her to rest or try to find out more about who she was. Her features, once so strange to him, now seemed almost familiar. as though he had seen them somewhere before. But where? Her eyelids fluttered, and she let out a soft moan, her body shifting slightly under the blanket. Jason stood up quickly, his instincts telling him that this was a crucial moment. Her eyes opened, though they were dull at first, and they flickered around the room as if trying to make sense of her surroundings. When they finally rested on him, Jason's heart skipped a beat. There was something powerful in her gaze, something ancient and intelligent that defied the weak, fragile state of her body. Who are you? Her voice was weak, hoarse, barely a whisper. But there was an undeniable urgency in it. Jason hesitated, unsure of how to respond. What could he say to her? What should he tell her? But before he could speak, she lifted her hand weakly, and the faintest of smiles crossed her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling, as if she couldn't quite believe she was alive. Jason's throat tightened. He had no idea who she was, but in that moment, with her gratitude directed at him, something inside him softened. He couldn't just leave her there. He had to help her, even if he didn't understand why. "Don't worry," Jason replied quietly. "You're safe now." She closed her eyes, her hand falling limp beside her as she sank back into a peaceful, though still fragile, slumber. Jason remained by her side, unsure of what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a sense that his life, however small and unremarkable it had been before, was about to take a turn into something far more extraordinary. Chapter 2. The Girl with the Secret. The days that followed the arrival of the strange girl on Jason's doorstep were filled with questions, both from him and from her. She recovered surprisingly quickly, considering the state she had been in when he found her. Her wound scrapes and bruises that covered most of her body healed at an unnatural pace, and the strange, almost ethereal glow that had surrounded her when he first laid eyes on her never fully faded. It wasn't as if she were glowing like a star, but there was a faint luminescence to her skin, a shimmering quality that Jason couldn't quite explain. As the days passed, she began to speak more, revealing bits and pieces of her past, though never in a straightforward manner. She called herself Nari. Her voice was quiet, and each word seemed to take effort, as if she were holding back from saying too much too soon. She told him she came from a distant planet, one far beyond Earth's reach. She spoke of her people in vague terms, how they had been scattered, driven into hiding by a powerful force that sought to destroy them. Her people were warriors, protectors of an ancient secret, but they had fallen, and now, she was the last of her kind. Jason listened intently, though he couldn't entirely wrap his mind around the idea. A warrior? A princess, perhaps, of some faraway alien world? It all sounded too fantastic, too unreal to make sense. But there was something in her eyes, a quiet strength that suggested her words held truth. And no matter how much he wanted to deny it, everything about her, the way she moved, the way she spoke, the strange, almost intangible aura that surrounded her spoke to something beyond the ordinary. She had nowhere to go, she told him, no family to return to, no place to call home. Earth, for all its flaws and struggles, had become her refuge. And though Jason still didn't fully understand why she had come to him, he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility toward her. Over the next few weeks, Nari's presence in Jason's life began to change everything. The quiet isolation he had once embraced now felt empty without her. They spent their days together, talking, walking through the city, or simply sitting in the small apartment as she shared stories of her people, her history, and the war that had decimated her kind. Jason found himself drawn to her, not just by her alien nature, but by the incredible strength she carried inside her. Despite the suffering she had endured, she still held on to a fierce will to survive, to protect whatever was left of her people's legacy. And in that bond, something unexpected began to form, a sense of family. She had no family left, no one to care for her, and Jason had never thought of himself as a father or protector. But in the time they had spent together, he realized that the connection between them had blossomed into something deeper than mere chance. She was no longer just a stranger who had appeared on his doorstep. She was family, someone he would protect with everything he had. But Nari had secrets. Secrets that Jason hadn't yet fully understood. And as their bond grew, the question remained, who was she really? And what had happened to her people? As Nari spent more time recovering in Jason's apartment, the more she began to open up, though still with caution. Her physical wounds were healing rapidly, but her emotional scars ran much deeper. There were moments when Jason would catch her staring out the window, her eyes lost in some faraway memory, her brow furrowed in thought. She rarely spoke about her past without his prompting, and when she did, it was in fragments, as though she herself was still piecing together what had happened to her and her people. For days, she told Jason little bits of her history. Her voice trembled when she spoke of her home planet, Alaris, a lush world that had once been a thriving hub of advanced civilizations, a place where knowledge and peace had reigned supreme. But then came the invasion. Nari spoke of a shadowy force, an enemy with technology so advanced it seemed almost magical, that had descended upon her world and decimated everything in its path. Her people, skilled warriors and defenders of their planet, had fought bravely, but they were no match for the overwhelming power of their enemies. They came in the dead of night, she explained one evening, her voice soft but carrying the weight of a history that was beyond Jason's understanding. My people were taken by surprise. The invaders used weapons that warped time and space. My planet was burning even before they landed. Many of my people, they did not survive. But we fought. We fought until there was nothing left. Jason listened intently, his mind struggling to grasp the enormity of what she was describing. The idea of an alien world under siege by an unstoppable force seemed almost impossible. But the look in her eyes told him it wasn't a fantasy. It was a reality that had shattered the very foundations of her existence. He wanted to ask more questions, to dig deeper into her story, but something about her fragile state made him hold back. Instead, he offered a simple comfort. "I'm sorry," Jason said quietly, his voice filled with sincerity. "It sounds like your people were brave." She nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line as she fought to keep the emotion from overwhelming her. "They were," she whispered, almost to herself. But bravery wasn't enough. And now I'm the last one. Jason didn't know what to say. What could anyone say in the face of such unimaginable loss? Instead, he simply sat beside her, offering the only thing he could, a shoulder to lean on, a presence that wouldn't judge or abandon her. Over the next few days, Nari continued to share bits and pieces of her past, but always with a sense of distance, as though she was struggling to come to terms with the full weight of what had happened. She told him of her escape, how she had fled the ruins of her home, leaving behind her family, her friends, everyone she had ever known. She spoke of wandering through the galaxy alone, finding no refuge, no place that could offer her safety or solace. "I didn't know where to go," she confessed one night, her voice small and broken. "I thought I was the only one left. And then I ended up on Earth, in the outskirts, where no one would find me. I didn't mean to end up here. But something told me this place was different." Jason, still uncertain of the full truth, couldn't help but ask, "How did you find your way to my doorstep?" Nari hesitated, her eyes darting away as if avoiding the question. She seemed to struggle with the answer, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket around her shoulders. I don't know," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I had no strength left. I was starving, exhausted, and I couldn't go any further. Something led me to you. I don't know how, but I just ended up here." Jason's heart went out to her. He had never considered that the world could be so vast, so unknowable, and that an alien being like Nari could be so utterly lost, cast adrift in a universe that felt indifferent to her existence. She had survived so much, and yet, in the end, all she wanted was a place to call home, a place where she could heal from the scars of her past. The following days brought a sense of routine to their lives, though it was a strange and unfamiliar one. Nari, despite her mysterious origins, was adapting to life on Earth. She was fascinated by the simplest things, the sights, the sounds, the way humans lived. Jason found himself teaching her about his world, showing her the basics of life on Earth, how to use a stove, how to read human books, how to navigate the internet. Nari's mind, sharp as it was, absorbed everything quickly, her curiosity never fading, and her desire to learn only growing. But there was something more to Nari than just her alien background. There was a strength within her, a quiet resilience that Jason could see in her every action. She was still physically weak, still recovering from the ordeal that had nearly destroyed her, but Jason couldn't ignore the aura of determination that surrounded her. It was as if the trauma she had endured had only sharpened her will, made her more focused, more intent on surviving, even when all seemed lost. There was more to Nari than just being a victim of circumstance. She had been forged by fire, tempered by unimaginable pain, and yet, she remained standing. One evening, after a quiet dinner in Jason's modest kitchen, Nari sat down beside him on the couch, her legs tucked underneath her. Her eyes, usually distant and wary, were now full of a calm intensity. She had something to say. Jason could feel it. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice soft but steady. "I'm not sure how long I can stay here. I don't want to be a burden. I'm grateful for everything you've done for me, but I don't belong here. I can't stay hidden forever." Jason's heart skipped a beat, and he turned to her, seeing the conflict in her eyes. "What do you mean? You don't have to leave. You've been through so much. You're welcome here. You have a place with me." Nari shook her head, her expression hardening. "I don't belong to this world. I can't just forget who I am, forget what's happened to my people. I have to find a way to fix this. I have to find others like me, if there are any left. I can't let my people's legacy be forgotten." Jason swallowed hard, his throat tight. He understood her drive, her need for purpose, her longing for something more than just survival. He didn't know how he could help her, but he knew he couldn't let her go alone. "You're not alone," he said, his voice firm, determined. "I'll help you. Whatever you need. We'll figure this out together." Nari's eyes softened, and she reached out to him, placing a hand on his arm. Her touch was warm, comforting. "You don't know how much that means to me. I don't know where this journey will take us, but I'm glad you're with me." And in that moment, Jason realized something profound. Despite all the pain, all the loss, Nari had given him a gift. She had brought meaning to his life, a life that had once been marked by quiet solitude and resignation. Now, he had a purpose, a reason to keep going. Nari had become more than a stranger who appeared on his doorstep. She had become his family. Chapter 3, The Unlikely Bond. Over the next few weeks, Jason and Nari fell into an unusual but comforting rhythm. Their lives, once separate, had woven together in a way neither of them had expected. Nari's presence in Jason's apartment, quiet but profound, had transformed the space. What had once been a simple, solitary place of rest for Jason now felt more alive, more full of purpose. It was as though she had brought something into his life that he had long been missing, something intangible, but deeply meaningful. Nari had started helping around the apartment, cooking meals, tidying up, and slowly, Jason could see how her confidence grew. The frail, broken girl who had arrived at his doorstep, barely able to stand, was slowly returning to her original form. Her healing was physical, certainly, but Jason knew that the psychological scars she carried would take far longer to heal. They were unspoken, buried in her guarded eyes and the way she would occasionally stare off into the distance, lost in memories that Jason could not reach. He respected her silence, but he also couldn't help but wonder how much of her past she was still holding back. As much as Nari wanted to learn about Earth and its ways, she was still haunted by the loss of her people and the devastating destruction of her world. In between the days of mundane tasks and quiet meals, she would often retreat into herself, and Jason would give her space, understanding that the burden of everything she had survived weighed heavily on her. But he could never escape the question that lingered in his mind. Why had she come to him? There were billions of people on Earth. Why had the universe, fate, or whatever forces at play had led her to his doorstep? And why had she trusted him? It was on one of these quiet evenings, with the apartment dimly lit by the warm glow of a single lamp, that Nari decided to open up again. They were sitting on the couch, Jason's mind wandering as he flipped through a book he had been reading. When she spoke, her voice soft but steady, breaking the silence between them. "I've been thinking," she began, the words carefully chosen, "about my people, about what happened to them. I can't just let them be forgotten, Jason." Jason put the book down, sensing the gravity in her tone. "I understand. You've been through a lot, but maybe we could take it one step at a time. There's no rush." Nari shook her head, her eyes intense, almost pleading. "No, there is. I can feel it. My people, their history, it's not just something that can fade away. The invaders, they've done something terrible, and I need to stop it. I need to make sure my people's legacy survives. I can't just live here, in this small world, while everything I've known is lost to time. It's not right." Jason looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes, the strength she was trying to reclaim. Her words were raw, laden with the weight of a mission that went far beyond their small life together. She wasn't just healing. She wasn't just trying to survive. She was planning, plotting, determined to right the wrongs that had been done to her and her world. "What can we do?" Jason asked quietly. He didn't fully understand what she was going through, what she needed, but he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let her do this alone. Nari was silent for a moment, her gaze distant as she seemed to gather her thoughts. When she spoke again, it was with a clarity and resolve that Jason couldn't ignore. "The ship," she said softly. "The ship that brought me here. It's still out there, somewhere in the galaxy. I've been tracking it since I arrived, picking up faint signals, trying to connect the dots. It's part of a larger network, a fleet that's been hunting down my people, destroying them." Jason's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't known what she had been doing all this time, the strange moments when she would disappear into the corner of the apartment, huddled over some device, analyzing patterns he couldn't see. But now it all clicked. She hadn't just been recovering. She had been searching for the means to find her enemies, searching for the ship that had been part of the catastrophe that had shattered her life. "So what's the plan?" Jason asked, leaning forward, his hands resting on his knees. "How do you find them? How do we stop them?" Nari met his gaze, her eyes burning with a fierce determination that Jason could no longer ignore. "I have the information," she said, her voice steady but filled with an urgency that set Jason's blood racing. "I know where they've been, where they're headed. There's a place I can go, a system far from here. If we can get there, we can find out what happened to the rest of my people. I need to confront them, Jason. I need to understand what they've done and why they've destroyed everything." Jason sat in silence for a long moment, processing the enormity of what she was asking. This wasn't just about helping an alien woman who had arrived on his doorstep. It was about joining a cause, a mission that could take them to the farthest reaches of the galaxy. It was about standing up against forces beyond his comprehension and taking on an enemy that had torn apart an entire civilization. He knew the risks. He knew the dangers. The idea of venturing out into space, to face something as powerful as what Nari had described, was daunting, terrifying even. But there was something about her resolve, something about the way she looked at him, that made him feel as if he had no choice. If he had any part to play in this galaxy-shattering mission, he would help her. There was no going back now. "All right," Jason said finally, his voice firm. "We'll do this. We'll find them, Nari. Together." Nari's eyes softened, her expression full of gratitude, but also something deeper, something almost like relief. The weight of the mission hadn't lifted, but there was comfort in knowing that someone who didn't have to care, had made the decision to help her. She reached out and took his hand in hers, her small, delicate fingers wrapping around his, as if grounding herself. "Thank you," she whispered, the words trembling in her voice. "Thank you for believing in me, for believing in us." Jason squeezed her hand gently. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together. You've already given me more than I ever thought I'd have. You're not alone anymore." For the first time since she had arrived, Jason saw a flicker of peace in Nari's eyes, a sense of hope that he hadn't realized had been missing. As she sat beside him, her hand in his, they both knew that their lives had changed forever. The galaxy was vast and dangerous and unpredictable, but for once, Jason didn't feel small. He felt like part of something bigger, something that mattered. They weren't alone anymore. They had each other. And with that bond between them, they would face whatever the galaxy had in store. The days following their conversation marked a turning point in Jason and Nari's journey. Jason, once a man who had contented himself with the simplicity of his life, now found himself caught in a whirlwind of uncertainty and excitement. His world, once quiet and predictable, had become a vast, unknowable expanse. Nari, the alien woman who had appeared on his doorstep so unexpectedly, had ignited something in him, a sense of purpose that he had never felt before. The more they worked together to prepare for their journey, the more Jason learned about Nari's world, about the things she had lost, and the things she was determined to reclaim. She had spent years on the run, surviving on little more than scraps, hiding in the dark corners of the galaxy, always one step ahead of those who would destroy her people. Now, she had a chance to confront her enemies, to uncover the truth, and to reclaim the future that had been stolen from her. Jason couldn't ignore the enormity of what they were about to do. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a hero. He had no experience with galactic warfare or the advanced technology Nari spoke of. But none of that mattered. Nari had placed her trust in him, and that alone was enough to drive him forward. He wasn't about to let her down. Not now, not ever. The first thing they needed was a ship. Jason didn't have the means to procure something as advanced as the starships Nari spoke of, but he had a knack for mechanics. His skills, though limited to Earthbound technology, were useful in ways he hadn't expected. Nari had a strange piece of equipment with her, some kind of small, personal device that could interface with any starship's computer systems. She said it was a beacon, a signal that could be sent out to other survivors of her kind. She had used it sparingly, only when she absolutely had to, for fear that the invaders would detect it and track her down. Together, they worked tirelessly, breaking down old equipment, piecing together the scraps of what they could find in Jason's apartment and local scrapyards. It wasn't a luxury ship by any means, but it would suffice. The plan was simple: find the coordinates of the survivors, get to the ship, and set course for the star system where they hoped to find the answers to Nari's people's fate. As the days wore on, Jason and Nari spent more time together, more than they had ever anticipated. With each passing moment, their connection deepened, and Jason realized that something had changed in him, something profound. Nari was no longer just a stranger. She wasn't just the mysterious alien who had appeared out of nowhere. She had become his family, and he couldn't imagine going on this journey without her by his side. One night, after a particularly long day of repairs, they sat together, side by side, on the couch. The stars outside were just starting to come into view, their distant lights twinkling like tiny diamonds against the dark canvas of the night. Nari was quiet, her eyes lost in thought as she gazed out the window, her expression distant. "You know," Jason said softly, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking. We don't know what we're going to find out there. What if we don't find anything? What if your people are gone, and we're just chasing ghosts?" Nari turned to him, her golden eyes locking with his. There was a depth in those eyes, a weight that only someone who had lost everything could understand. "I don't know what we'll find," she said quietly, "but I have to try. I can't live with myself if I don't know the truth. If I don't find out what happened to them, if I let the galaxy forget they even existed, it will be like letting them die all over again." Jason nodded slowly, understanding the pain in her voice. He had never faced anything like what she had, but he could sense the urgency, the need for closure. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about finding justice, finding her people's story, and ensuring that they would not be erased from history. "Then we'll go," Jason said firmly, his voice full of resolve. "No matter what happens, we'll find the truth. I'll be with you every step of the way." Nari's eyes softened, and she gave him a faint smile. "Thank you, Jason," she said, her voice full of emotion. "I don't know how I could do this without you." Jason met her gaze, feeling a connection that ran deeper than mere words. They had become more than companions on a journey. They had become something stronger, a partnership, a family, bound by purpose and mutual respect. As the days passed, they finished preparing the ship, making the necessary repairs, and ensuring that it would be able to travel through the stars. Jason had never piloted a starship before, but with Nari's guidance, he quickly learned the basics of navigation and flight. She showed him the controls, explaining how everything worked, though she was often vague about certain details. She had clearly been trained in the art of space travel, but there were certain aspects of her past she still kept hidden. The time had come. Their ship, though not much more than a patchwork of parts and technology, was ready to launch. The coordinates were set, and Jason sat at the controls, his hands steady but his mind racing with uncertainty. This wasn't just a repair job now. It wasn't just a simple journey to some distant corner of space. It was a mission, one that could change the fate of an entire civilization. They were going to face the unknown, and they were going to do it together. "Ready?" Jason asked, glancing over at Nari. Nari gave him a determined nod, her expression serious. "Let's do this." With that, Jason activated the ship's engines, and the small vessel lurched forward, breaking free from the atmosphere of Earth. As they ascended into the vast expanse of space, Jason couldn't help but feel a mixture of awe and fear. The galaxy was an endless sea of stars, each one representing a possibility, a story, a life. And in that moment, Jason realized that he and Nari were part of something much bigger than themselves. They were bound by fate, by choice, and by the unspoken promise to find the truth no matter the cost. Chapter 4. The journey begins. The ship's engines hummed steadily as it navigated through the endless void of space. Jason piloted the vessel with careful precision, his hands guiding the controls as Nari sat beside him, her eyes fixed on the readouts. The stars outside seemed to pass by in a blur as the ship accelerated toward their destination, the distant star system where Nari believed the answers to her people's fate lay. They had no guarantees, no way of knowing what they would find when they arrived. All they had was the hope that Nari's instincts, her drive to find her people, would lead them to anything that could help her piece together the shattered remnants of her past. The silence between them was comfortable, though it held a weight in understanding that they were no longer just two people caught in the vastness of space. They were partners, and what lay ahead of them was uncertain, but together, they would face it. As the days passed, they settled into a routine, navigating from one star system to the next, following the coordinates Nari had painstakingly pieced together. The ship's small quarters became their sanctuary, a place where they could rest, share stories, and plan their next move. Nari's physical wounds had healed, but the emotional scars she carried remained. Yet Jason could see a change in her. She was beginning to find peace, or at least a measure of it. Each day, she grew stronger, more confident in her mission, and Jason found himself becoming more and more invested in her cause. But as the ship approached the coordinates they had set, something changed. The signals grew stronger, more intense. They were getting closer. Jason's pulse quickened as the reality of what they were about to face became more and more real. What had once been an abstract mission, a distant hope, was now unfolding before them. They were about to uncover the truth, to face the people who had destroyed Nari's world, and the consequences of that confrontation would be felt across the galaxy. "We're almost there," Nari said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "Whatever happens next, we do this together. We finish what we started." Jason nodded, gripping the controls tightly. "Together," he repeated. And with that, the ship plunged into the unknown, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. The journey had begun, and there was no turning back.